Sherlock Holmes as Dugan and the Technological Essence. An essay on inference. So this presentation is on the technological essence understood as the problems of analytic philosophy. So by inference, I mean what's called technically abduction. There's probably a Stanford encyclopedia entry on it that doesn't particularly concern us here. In other words, it may be of some considerable interest within certain limits of those departments that practice the inquiry into that goes under the rubric abduction. But here we'll speak more broadly of just of inference and of the technological essence as dealing with inference and what that implies. So inference, we'll start by saying inference is being said, and abduction also, is being said specifically against the pairing of deduction, induction. So there's a considerable amount of zeal behind, especially in the so-called STEM fields. People that go into STEM still believe there's this thing called induction, and that we're just sort of casting. It's as though to say when we cast our angler's line into the cracks in the stones at the edge of the ocean, it's not some specific type of fish we're looking for, but as though we were just looking at the raw data of the universe, the language of the universe, as Galileo said. And there's a lot of zeal behind this. We're just looking at the naked objective truth. We're not. There's nothing. There's no prejudice behind. There's no prejudice, as Nietzsche says, behind our mode of inquiry. It's not like human beings for tens of thousands of years looked up at the sky and thought, wouldn't it be cool to fly? It's just that somehow we accidentally developed flying machines. It had nothing to do with the fact that we were looking for all kinds of devices that could help us do that. And likewise with the basic physics. It's not that there's because of the theory of Planck and Einstein that light has to, and because of experiments that came earlier, that light is the one thing that resists frame of reference that in the universe doesn't show trailing off the way in a way that reveals that we're in a frame of reference, but always remains at the same speed. Even it's not like the case. It doesn't reveal the frame of reference. The ultimate frame of reference doesn't reveal itself so far as we use light in the way a pendulum reveals that the Earth is in a frame of reference. Because they wanted to get out of the frame. So in other words, there's always these specific reasons why we're looking for the type of thing we're looking for. And then Einstein has specific things he's into where he says it's not simply that Einstein is better than Newton, because obviously you still have this, and it's not simply that solving these supposed toe problems or theory of everything problems would really be to solve the problems objectively. It's rather that some guys wanted to solve some problems, and so they developed new apparatuses that look for certain things, and it goes on like that. And so let's say, but why in theory? So what is? Let's first just say what Sherlock Holmes does. Give it some illustration. Does Sherlock Holmes do pure deduction? No, he doesn't start with a principle supposedly taken from outside the stream of time, which isn't like a tree or a human being or a stone, but which supposedly, like the theory of parallel lines, for instance. I think the ancients actually, though, also were somewhat disturbed by the theory of parallel lines. They weren't sure that it was true, rather than asymptotic, or rather than the things that gave rise to the non-Euclidean geometry. But whether the rule, we could just call it a rule, like the rules-based order. It's just something somebody made up. It's like the American version of the universal human rights. They call it universal human rights, but as Alain de Benoit, close ally of Dugin, has shown, there's all kinds of other versions that also call themselves universal human rights. I think some guys in Kenya said this is the African universal version of human rights, which of course defeats the purpose because it has a specific coloring on it now. Just like I think in Dubai they said, oh, this is the Muslim version of universal human rights. In order to say what you're calling the universal human rights is the same type of thing Zizek is always criticizing as the false universal. Just a mere claim to being the universal in the same way that somebody who says white trash can't come forward and say white trash can have pride, but other minorities can, because supposedly white trash blends with the dominant white Anglo-Saxon white WASP culture or something. I mean, I think at least the older way of looking at it makes more sense than the current way. The older way of looking at it is kind of like if one group is relatively privileged, then make movies making fun of showing them slipping on a banana peel, make fun of them, don't make fun of the people that are already lower in the extra legal hierarchy. I think that was the older attitude, but now it's fallen into the sort of absolutist chaos. Tucker Carlson, no, I'm absolutist, free speech, blah, blah, blah. Which of course makes no sense. But what does make sense is, what would be the opposite of that? It would be saying, here we have this principle of free speech, but we have to be kind of prudential about it. We have to infer the best usage of it. So likewise, just as it's true, we still have something like rules and something like inductive cases that fit with the rules. Like we have the periodic table, for instance, that tells us that everything should be understood in terms of certain particle counts and certain ways of looking at things, which, however, obviously don't take into account the new physics and talk of like, for instance, the guy Hasok, Chang, wrote a book which I think was called something like Is H2O Water? And then he said, when you just have H2O straight out, you miss all these other microparticles which weren't taken into account, because really the periodic table is just this idea that you could synthesize things like urine, for instance, which are thought to only come from living beings, but which then it turns out you can make them just through the combining chemical elements through synthesis, something like that. But then it turns out not to be ideally true, which then probably leads to things like the Challenger accident at length, because you think, oh, this is mostly reliable in terms of its stochastic predictability, but then of course you get black swans. So NASA then stands for need another 7 astronauts, as the saying goes. Under the notion that the reason that crash happened wasn't some blunt human error. Maybe it has already been proven to be, but just say, for the sake of it, that it was simply that every so often there will be some malfunctions like that. Just like on our devices, we often notice that every so often there's some hygiene needed. Somehow you need to reset the device, and it helps. Something like that, because there's things that go outside what's really in the theory, and they break down somehow. So like this what Sherlock Holmes does is he doesn't just go from a super deduction or a Platonic idea supposed to come from outside the empirical realm, didn't arise at a certain moment of time, doesn't go away at a certain moment of time, always there, truth according to the Greeks, and then look at some details which will then be perfect. I guess this is already known by Aristotle, I think, sort of. He just doesn't think it's true. He thinks what the principles say it must be ultimately true. And then what he says is, like, there's a singular that's outside what he's defining as the laws of thought. That's outside the notion of the Aglai Shah, or the identity, the principle of identity. But that doesn't really matter, because it's a false understanding somehow, or it's below the understanding you get when you have autocracy, or when you're self-autonomous somehow. When you maximize the powers of the human animal according to logicon, according to the logical life, then you find out that this is the truth so far. I mean, this is the best we can sort of approximate to the truth. He'll admit that I suppose Aristotle's way of looking at it is, there is kind of this singular situation of, which is generally referred to as the accidental world, and but we can know that we want to approximate as best as we can do with the material we have, get it to play out the theater drama of the wisest dramatists, which show us the sort of Plutarch examples of moral life, to be more like the brother that prevents the other brother from becoming a tyrant, even though everybody hates him, including his own mother. Something like that. Timophane's and Timoleon example. To approximate more towards these true examples, which, however, can be discovered. But instead, inference in the Sherlock Holmes sense is more like, there's a man in yellow shoes. We saw him around the area when the robbery occurred at the bank. 2 weeks later, we saw him buying a Bugatti or some, is that the name of those expensive cars that you see around London? We saw him buying a pricey car in cash. And then you may draw an inference. So it's not like that there's some pure inductive data that's precisely corresponds to a principle, and then you do some kind of casuistry, or some kind of theory of the case that then you read into a specific case. It's rather, you kind of look at both edges, and then you kind of make a prudential judgment, and then you kind of say, I think I infer out of this based on what usually happens. This guy probably is a good he's probably our suspect. Then in the official language, I keep calling it the suspect, according to again, according to some principle, some general principle. But the actual officers, of course, one knows, have decided this is the man, and that's it. And then you think, oh, Sherlock Holmes is supposedly, he represents the best one at this, who doesn't make as many mistakes as the regular investigators or detectives do. Somehow he's a genius at drawing in these kind of inferences. And this is basically a picture of the modern sciences. It just hasn't quite got there yet. We just haven't quite accepted it in our politics yet. But probably we should, because that's what you arrive at when you really thoroughly think it all through. So Dugan is already kind of like that, and he's looking at both sides, and not necessarily because he regards that as the right conclusion through thinking all that through, but more like, I think, because that's his nature is like that, if you want to put it in the Greek way, by a metaphor. If you want to put it by metaphor in the old way, his integral character is kind of, I think, still the notion of the philosopher as the one who, every time they encounter common sense, is their shoal, their guilt, their feeling of uneasiness is at work. They're not certain. They don't accept Descartes. And one looks, and then one sees something that makes more sense, which is that we should be more aware. It's in a way just being more aware of the problem than the person that would just say, oh, well, now the police have a suspect. But then when you're a little more aware, you kind of look and you're like, no, it's, as I just said, it's like, no, they don't really think it's a suspect. They're sure this is the guy. They're just calling it the suspect. Things like that. You have to be aware at every stage of, maybe Descartes just telling us we've achieved certainty because of his notion of extension as being vouchsafed by some investigations of the mind, and which can't be done away with by the fact that that very mind or psychology might just be an empirical mind or psychology. This is then the whole problem of psychologism comes in. Whether our psychology is primary or whether logical thinking is primary. These considerations taken into consideration outside Andersets and confronting them, it again and again reinforces our sense that we can't sort of have we should have Kafka to some extent, like in the Agamben sense. We should have Kafka to some extent because Kafka is saying there is no such thing as law, and this is how it's really like, in the way he shows in his fables. There are all kinds of paradigm shifts out of Aristotle's dunamis and energia, which suggests the whole region which suggests dunamis and energia as something like biology or something like chemistry or something like a science which has a specific mode of creating concepts, a specific mode of seeing whether the data is verified or not. The situation with dunamis and energia are like the situation with the new geometries. They give rise to a different awareness of what was happening, and then you step back and then you're like, oh, this is one field alongside others, the study of potentialities, study of the absolute potentiality of God, study of the Hegelian absolute, etc. I throw that in kind of in a ad hoc and not any exact way, but nonetheless it does match up, but it would take a long time to expose the details clearly, and as a considerable amount of skill. But if we looked at some passages in Heidegger, then we could kind of assure ourselves that there was something serious behind a statement like that. So, in Agamben, when he talks about Josephine the singer in Kafka, he gives the example of somebody who says, well, maybe Kristen Stewart says this, well, I was never really a director. I never really knew how to direct. There's no such thing as really knowing how to direct. You just do it. You're in the stream. Maybe the hidden planet of Ketu is influencing you. Maybe it's not. And then you do something, and Josephine the singer is supposed to do something called piping, which isn't exactly singing, but the ordinary people say she's the greatest singer that there ever was, because they don't care about all these fine point distinctions. And then it's kind of like, the notion of the potential, or somebody is a singer, so they have the dunamis or potential to sing at any time, but this person claims they were never actually a singer. So the Aristotle's sort of thing, I guess you could find all kinds of ways to resuscitate it, right? You could say, well, they weren't a singer, they were something slightly different, a different genus. And then you would start to have to spawn infinite geniuses, and then somebody would say, oh, but one of them is the right one, in the same way Aristotle says one definition of Fusus is the right one, or in the Locus they say one definition of courage is better than the others. And then again it gives other versions, like the Glenn Gould version. Glenn Gould knows how to play, but knowing how to play, he withholds from playing, and somehow does something else. It's more like the guy that did those musical experiments with silence. It's more in that direction. So there's all kinds of different ways to deviate from this and still to remain intelligible to oneself, with the new intelligibility is a new kind of deductive rule. It's just a rule. And then we have to decide whether we want to stick with that rule and the induction that kind of goes along with it, or not. And then there's a sort of question of inferring whether this is to go on like in these fields makes sense or not, and that's a kind of Sherlock Holmes activity, and that's a kind of Dugan activity in some ways. I've come to be persuaded that this sort of ad Hitlerium thing, whatever else is wrong with it from a point of view of being more thoughtful, it has a certain sense in that, like, it's sort of like fascist is being used just to be a synonym for authoritarian. Like when I was talking to Lucy Hayes in the conversation, it's sort of like that occurred to me, like, okay, is fascist really any different than what Mark Rutte and Donald Tusk are, calling authoritarians in the East? Sort of like, yeah, you could try to define it differently, but it's sort of like a play and a metonymy and a complex sort of stretching out in different directions. But taken that way, we should understand that the fascist as a kind of guide, El Duce, leader, path leader, forest path leader, guide, Führer, is a kind of Sherlock Holmes. And then correspondingly, we could see this style of doing things, which sort of connects to the German historicist view, this style of saying we need somebody to draw inference out of the immediate situation like a genuine sovereign. This style of doing things, even though it tends towards the risk of either Aristotle is right or Lord Acton is right, more power for the good is good, or power tends to corrupt, and power tends to corrupt absolutely. I don't know if you need the word tends in the second statement, or whether it's sort of already implied, or what's going on there exactly. I suppose it's just implied so people admit it. That's my version. Maybe that ought to be corrected. So then if you state it straightforwardly, absolute power tends to corrupt absolutely, therefore we should be against authoritarians, the dreaded authoritarians. But Sherlock Holmes is an authoritarian, so that's my provocation.